Today, I thought I would share the historical events that I feel have come up time and time again in the Russian literature that I read. I'm a graduate student researching Russian literature and Russian history, and I honestly wish that I had a comprehensive list like this when I had started my studies. Instead, I had to learn the old-fashioned way by reading and researching tons. Because it can be really alienating when you pick up a Russian novel and you don't know the historical figures they're talking about or the wars that they're talking about. And so while I obviously am not in the business of providing a comprehensive history of all the territories comprising of the former Russian Empire, I am just going to tell you 10 key events that I think are worth knowing, and I'll also talk about the books or poetry in which they come up. All right, the first event I want to talk about occurred in the year 980, and that's when Volodymyr the Great, who was a prince of the Novgorod province, united Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus into one kingdom called Kievan Rus, and their shared religion was Eastern Orthodox Christianity. So Volodymyr the Great was a pagan, and then he married a Christian woman and he converted, and that's why all these countries have Eastern Orthodoxy as their main religion today. The reason this is so important is that Volodymyr the Great has become a central figure in contemporary Russian propaganda. You'll see him talked about a lot by Putin, mentioned in Putin's essays. There are children's novels, cartoons, and TV shows all about Volodymyr the Great, who in Russia is called Vladimir. And this is sort of the origin story of Ukraine and Russia's brotherhood, so to speak. All right. Fast forwarding a little bit to the 13th century, we have the Mongol invasion of Kievan Rus, which was started by Batu Khan, who was the grandson of Genghis Khan. And he established the Golden Horde, which was a semi-independent khanate under the Mongol Empire. And the Russians were under the Mongol yoke for 200 years. Which when you think about it is such a long time. I mean, Canada is younger than that even. So of course they're referenced throughout the literature, but they're referred to almost exclusively as Tatars. And Tatar is an umbrella term for Turkic ethnic groups. So you can keep your eyes peeled for that. But essentially the Mongol yoke ended in 1480 when one prince in Moscow, I think it's Ivan III, he stood up to the Mongols at the Great Stand. It's called the Great Stand on the Ugra River, and it ended peacefully. The Mongols just withdrew, but I'm totally telling this the wrong way. I hope you know I'm speaking from memory, so I'm just doing my best here, but throughout those 200 years, there were people that benefited from the Mongol yoke, and a lot of these people were the princes in Moscow because they actually collaborated with the Mongols. So they would get kind of special deals on paying taxes, and the whole system of kind of the Mongols' rule over Russia was that Russians were obliged to pay tribute to the Mongols in forms of grain, etc. And obviously, people didn't like doing this. And the princes started to realize, hey, why are we still paying tribute to these Mongols? Because they're fighting amongst themselves. They're getting a lot weaker. Let's take advantage of it. This is our moment. And so they finally freed themselves 200 years later after lots of, battles and skirmishes and so on. But one important thing is that the Mongols actually allowed Eastern Orthodox Christianity to remain the dominant religion in the countries which they occupied. I feel like I keep saying Russia, Russia, Russia. I mean the territories comprising the former Russian Empire. Yeah. All right, now a couple centuries later, we have the split, or what is known as the schism, between the old and the new believers. So the old believers are the people who adhere to the practices of Eastern Orthodox Christianity before the reforms of Patriarch Nikon of Moscow, and this happened in the mid-1600s. These reforms came about and people didn't like them, and some of them stayed with the old ways. And one thing that the old believers are known for is crossing themselves with only 2 fingers as opposed to the customary 3. Now, this split or schism in Russian was called the raskol, and this means a cleaving apart. And you might recognize that word raskol from one of literature's most famous characters of all time, Raskolnikov, from Fyodor Dostoevsky's novel Crime and Punishment. And that is fully intentional. So Raskolnikov's name reflects this split, or this kind of stepping over the threshold from the old into the new. And if you've read the book, that makes a lot of sense given Raskolnikov's unconventional philosophy. Fyodor Dostoevsky himself was very, very religious. He also references the old believers, I believe, in The Idiot. And you'll see them talked about throughout. I mean, this sect still exists today. Yeah. All right. I also really want to talk about Peter the Great. Now, he might be the most referenced historical figure in Russian literature, and this is no coincidence. I mean, he founded the city of St. Petersburg, which was the capital from the early 1700s when it was finally built, all the way up into the 1900s, until the Bolsheviks switched it to Moscow. But essentially, Peter the Great was really obsessed with Europe. Russia wasn't viewed as part of Europe. They were viewed as something apart, something foreign, backward. And he was tired of Russia being viewed that way. He was really inspired by his travels to Western Europe, and he wanted to build a European city, architecturally, culturally, and he did that. He saw what was a great swamp land and decided to build a city there. And in the process, countless people died. So it's known as a city built upon bones. And that's why the Petersburg text, which is a tradition in Russian literature, in that tradition, Petersburg is depicted as a city full of ghosts, of double meanings, madness, falsity. And this all stems from the fact that, a city wasn't really meant to be built here, and yet somehow it was. And so many people sacrificed their lives in the process for this. Yeah, I find it so fascinating. God, I love Petersburg texts. The most famous one is The Bronze Horseman, which is a poem, like a poem story by Alexander Pushkin. And in that poem, the bronze statue of Peter the Great comes alive and chases this guy throughout the city, and there's a flood and lots of things going on. It's a must read in any introductory Russian literature class. The other famous one is Nikolai Gogol's short story, The Overcoat. And in that story, a bureaucrat living in Petersburg gets his overcoat stolen by someone who looks identical to him. No. Okay, don't even talk to me. I'm getting mixed up with The Double, but it doesn't matter. I also really love the story Nevsky Prospect by Nikolai Gogol, and Nevsky Prospect is the most famous street in St. Petersburg. A prospect is essentially like a large avenue with trees running down it, and it's where people go to stroll and walk, and I just love this kind of performative dimension of prospects in Russian literature, where they're seen as places for people to kind of parade themselves and show off their outfits and look at what others are up to, and I just find it fascinating. But St. Petersburg has had many names throughout Russian history. Sankt Petersburg, and then it was Petrograd in the early revolutionary days, and then Peter, and then Leningrad. I think I switched the order. It was Leningrad, then it was known as Peter. So lots of different names. We're back to St. Petersburg now, but yeah, Peter the Great, an important guy. All right, now about 100 years after St. Petersburg was built, we have Napoleon's invasion of Russia in the year 1812. And this is the war that Tolstoy's novel War and Peace is about. I have absolutely nothing to say about this war. You can go read that novel yourself. But one part that I find really interesting about it is the fact that when Napoleon's army finally made it to Moscow, they found the city completely burnt. And the legend has it that the people of Moscow burnt their own city and fled, rather than staying and becoming, subordinate to the French army. And there's a lot of debate about whether they actually burnt it themselves or whether it just happened accidentally in the chaos of invasion. I personally prefer to believe that they burned it down themselves because that just sits nicely with my imagination, but you can obviously think what you'd like. What can we say more about that? I think that's it. So about 13 years later, we have in 1825 the Decembrist revolt. Now, this was basically some soldiers, a group of soldiers, which back in the day were the nobility. They rebelled against the Tsar. They refused essentially to swear allegiance to the new Tsar because they wanted a constitutional monarchy. And these guys were either executed or exiled. So it was unsuccessful. They didn't get their constitutional monarchy until much, much later. We'll talk about that. But the main writer who sympathized with the Decembrists was Alexander Pushkin. And he was actually exiled for this sympathy, which he expressed in his poetry. And other famous writers who reference the Decembrists are Nikolai Nekrasov, Alexander Herzen, and Ivan Turgenev. So I feel like the Decembrists aren't talked about a lot, but it was a really, really important time in Russian history, and you're welcome to go read and explore more. So some 30 years later, we have the Crimean War, and this was a war fought between the Russian and Ottoman empires, mainly, and it was fought about who got to control the Eastern Orthodox population within the Ottoman territories. And Leo Tolstoy actually was a soldier in this war, and he published his Sevastopol sketches about this war, and it's essentially a collection of short stories all written from the point of view of a soldier walking through Sevastopol, observing higher ranking generals and their attitudes, but then also wounded soldiers and poor people. And there is a journalistic quality to these sketches that I find incredibly fascinating. And also you can really see baby Tolstoy at work. I mean, he was so young when he fought in this war, and this was pretty much his first piece of writing. And you can kind of see the seeds being planted of his later works in psychological realism. So totally give those a read. As for the outcome of those wars, pretty much like any wars, the territories shifted around a teeny bit at the cost of thousands of lives lost. Now, around that same time in 1861, we have the Emancipation of the serfs. So serfdom was finally abolished in Russia, and in case you're unfamiliar, serfs were essentially slaves, but they were tied to the land or the estate, not to particularly people. They weren't owned by people, but they just were viewed as belonging to an estate. And essentially these reforms came about because the intelligentsia, the Russian intelligentsia, was tired of being part of a backward country. They obviously saw the necessity for everyone to have freedom. But you can imagine this reform gave 23 million people their liberty. You went from essentially being a slave to a free man overnight, and obviously a lot of people didn't know what to do with that. A lot of serfs stayed with their masters. I should mention that serfs did have limited rights. They could work some of the land and sell like what they would produce. But suddenly you had this kind of shift in power where landowners were so in debt now because they had to pay their serfs wages all of a sudden. They would actually ask serfs if they could rent their land. And so while some serfs took advantage of being able to get married without their master's permission, being able to own businesses, property, a lot of them started uprisings, you know, and killed their masters, or it just wasn't this promising, beautiful thing that people thought it was going to be. It actually had a lot of unfortunate consequences for serfs and landowners alike. And I should say that serfs were obliged to now pay taxes on what they were growing. So they barely had enough food for survive. Landowners became impoverished. So these class structures, this economic structure you had for centuries, suddenly overnight is dissolved and there is nothing to take its place. And Russia wasn't really ready for that, and a lot of people suffered. All right, now we're getting to what I know is everyone's favorite part, and that's the Russian Revolution. Now, when you talk about the Russian Revolution in your everyday life, as I hope you do, be sure to be specific, because there were two in the early 20th century. There was the Revolution of 1905 and the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. So what happened in 1905 was essentially, it was a wave of strikes and mutinies because people were so fed up of being hungry, poor. Tsar Nicholas was doing a terrible job running the empire and taking care of the Russo-Japanese War, and they were just not happy. So he agreed to establish a constitutional monarchy. So finally the Decembrists got what they always wanted. Unfortunately, they were long dead, but this constitutional monarchy was a big deal. Suddenly, you know, we have the State Duma, the multi-party system, we have a Russian constitution, all these things that seemed so unthinkable before now finally happened. However, this did not feel revolutionary enough for people, which is why there was another one shortly after. So in 1914, Russia enters World War I. And once again, doesn't do too great. People are not happy, they're hungry, they're starving. And it all kind of culminated in March of 1917 when people took to the streets of Petrograd to protest, or I think they were chanting for bread. And Tsar Nicholas's army wavered. They didn't want to fight against their own people, whose complaints they viewed as justified. So Tsar Nicholas decided to abdicate the throne. The State Duma established their provisional government, which was led at the time by Alexander Kerensky. I'm not gonna lie, nobody talks about this guy. Nobody seems to care about him. The real deal was Vladimir Lenin, who was the leader of the Bolshevik Party. And so I believe in November of 1917, the Bolshevik Party had a successful coup of the provisional government. They took control, and then shortly after they executed, it was I think June 1918, they execute Tsar Nicholas, his wife, and all his children. Military firing squad killed them all. And to me, this is a really tragic episode of Russian history because, of course, no matter how much you hate your leader, you don't go around killing innocent children. And that's where this myth of the lost princess Anastasia comes from. Now, I should also say the Bolsheviks taking power, this was not greeted passively. This started the Russian Civil War, and that was fought between the Red Army, who were the communists, and the White Army, who were the imperialists. And the Red Army won in 1923, and so naturally, the aristocrats, the nobility who comprised of the White Army were no longer welcome in Russia, and they had to emigrate elsewhere. They mostly went to Paris and Berlin, and there is a really rich tradition of Russian emigre literature, which I'm happy to talk about in another video, but Essentially, these people went from being nobles in Russia to taxi drivers in Paris or doing sort of odd jobs all over the place. I think that's where I'm going to end this video, yeah. Because Soviet history is its own can of worms, and that's actually my specialty, so I'd be happy to make another video talking about it. But for now, I hope that I've given you enough context that you can kind of tackle the literature with more confidence. Obviously, feel free to investigate these events more. I know that I was super brief, but my goal was just to give you kind of a general picture of Russian history, and I wish you all the best with your reading. Take care. Bye-bye.